Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CWM. Today is August 31st, finally the last day of the month. Okay, today we want to pick up some economic knowledge about GDP and GDI, the definition and the difference. Probably we are mostly familiar with the GDP a lot, but we want to talk about also GDI. What is the difference and what is the definition? GDP is the abbreviation of gross domestic product. So we call GDP. And the definition is the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. So usually we go by year GDP or quarter GDP. Mostly we are familiar with the quarter GDP. And we will talk about how we calculate the GDP. Then you will know more about the GDP. And it's hard to imagine with just the definition itself. The formula to calculate the GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. So in a formula format, C plus I plus G plus NX. I think we can kind of imagine consumption. Okay, by the way, we will explain a little bit detail. And investment, of course, company invest, and also real estate investment includes included in this category, investment. And government spending. Of course, US government is a huge company to spend money. So we will add that. And also we will add a net export. And net export means simply the amount of export minus amount of imports. So we'll see a little bit detail. Okay, consumption means private consumption expenditures by household and nonprofit organizations. So every household, we're going to spend money. So we're going to add up. And also nonprofit organizations, they're going to spend money, we're going to add up also. And what about investment? But we can imagine all the business expenditures by businesses and home purchase by household. So as I said, real estate investment will be included in this category, investment. You can imagine the scale of the money. And government spending, of course, stands by G, the expenditure on goods and services by government, of course. Government is a huge spending machine. And as I said, net export, we call it NX, is the nation's export minus its imports. So we add up all this, it becomes a GDP, okay? And then basically we're talking about the growth of GDP. So compared to last quarter, is increased or declined, okay? And a little bit about the fact about the GDP is actually expenditure approach. So in other words, we'll add up all the expenditure of government and household and real estate investment, etc. That becomes GDP. Of course, plus the net export means, let's assume there are more import than export, then the total GDP will be reduced. Of course, right? Because the net export becomes minus. Okay. And this expenditure is primarily coming from three different groups. First, household, and second, businesses, and third, government. And the output produced in an economy has to be consumed by final users. Mainly three different groups that we mentioned: households, businesses, and government. And the sum of all the expenditure by three different groups should equal total output. We're talking about economy output. So we measure the total output by expenditure, how much we spend money from the three different groups, all the households in US and all the businesses in US and the government spending. And each country is supposed to keep this historical data, the GDP numbers, every quarter. I don't think we measure every month because that's too much. But every quarter, they record the GDP numbers so that they can compare it's going to be positive, it's going to be negative compared to the last quarter. And therefore, for the world economy, the World Bank and IMF periodically publish and maintain historical GDP data. That's why GDP data is so important, because it's a kind of a standard measurement of a economy, the country's economy is growing or is declining. And now this is important fact. Several consecutive quarters of positive GDP growth we will consider as expansion of economy. And a few consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth will consider that is recession. So this is basically economic definition of recession. Okay, so later on, we want to take a look at actual, the numbers, whether we are in expansion mode or whether we are in a recession mode, the current economy of US. And we want to move to a GDI. What about GDI? But GDI is different approach. GDI stands for gross domestic income. The abbreviation of gross domestic income is GDI. The definition is the measure of a nation's economic activities based on all of the money earned for all of the goods and services produced in the nation during a specific period. So this GDI is a totally different approach, but in a sense, it's kind of opposite. In other words, you make money, you earn the money, you earn the commission, you earn a salary, okay? And we're going to add up all this income nationwide. Essentially, that becomes GDI. So the formula to calculate GDI is wages plus and all the profits plus interest income plus rental incomes plus taxes and some statistical adjustment. So that becomes GDI. Let's check with some facts related to GDP and GDI. In theory, GDI equals to GDP, in theory. Essentially, GDI counts take in wages, profits, and taxes. And GDP counts the value of what the economy produces. So if you can say this, you pay the money and you put your effort, okay? In order to produce the goods and services. So in a sense, your income is take in, sort of input, and the GDP, the aggregated of all this, the expenditure is actually output. Basically, what the economy produces. So at the equilibrium in an economy, income equals spending, which means the GDI will be the same as GDP, but that's theory. It's not always exactly the same. And the difference usually a 1% plus minus. And the research shows that only estimates of GDI captured the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 better than GDP. Well, what does it mean? It means if you research GDI and if you monitor GDI, okay, that would be the better indicator of any economic move. Either is going to be expansion or is going to be the recession. That is what the historical research, the past research about the 2007 to 2009 recession. So the policymakers would have been better prepared if GDI was the main indicator used. But that means at the time, probably all the economists used the GDP to prepare the recession or expansion. And employee compensation share of GDI, employee compensation. So basically, your salaries, your commissions, etc. Okay, GDI includes employee compensation, right? That portion is also compared with the inflation trend line. In other words, if you see the employee compensation share of GDI, if it's increased, then you will see inflation. So generally, higher employee compensation share will correlate with upward trend in inflation. Okay, so we want to take a look at the current statistics. Current stats in 2021, 2022 in US. Let's take a look at the GDP. Fourth quarter of 2021, GDP growth was positive 1.7%. Well, last year, fourth quarter means kind of toward the end of the pandemic, right? And then we moved to first quarter of 2022. Then our GDP, USA GDP became minus 1.6%. And what about second quarter of 2022? The GDP growth was minus 0.6%. In fact, we're going to talk about in the news brief, the forecast was minus 0.9%, but they adjusted to, after all, they adjusted to a little bit better, minus 0.6%. So the actual was minus 0.6%. That means the US economy is doing pretty okay. In other words, better than we expected. Now, what about the annual 2021 GDP was 10.1%. So year 2021 is really kind of final phase of a pandemic, close to final phase of a pandemic. Overall, year 2021 GDP growth was plus 10.1%. And the total amount of GDP was $23 trillion in US. Now, what about GDI? GDI, the first quarter of 2022, this year, the first quarter, it was positive 1.8%. But compared to GDP, minus 1.6%. And second quarter of 2022, okay, it was positive 1.4%. And annual GDI in 2021 was positive 7.3%. Well, again, I'm not an expert on economies, but from the knowledge that we explained today, if GDI is positive continually for second quarters, what does it mean? It means it's not too bad. That's why actually one of news today or yesterday, the US economy is not doing that bad, okay, because the GDI is still positive, okay, compared to GDP. Now, by the definition of recession, okay, you remember this definition, a few, in other words, 2 or 3 consecutive quarters of a negative GDP growth, we defined as recession. Okay, 2 or 3, a few. So if we look at that, if we apply that, the theory, see GDP in first quarter and second quarter this year, both quarters, consecutive quarters, minus growth. So that means we are in recession by definition of this, the GDP growth. Well, still, I think we are debating US is in the recession or not, but GDP indicator shows 2 consecutive quarters negative growth. 네, 오늘 잠깐 리뷰를 해봤는데요. 물론 저도 경제 전문가는 아니지만 우리가 이거는 뭐 국민 시리즌으로서 상식이니까 지금 현재 미국이 어떻게 돌아가고 있느냐, 우리나라가 어떻게 돌아가고 있느냐, 가장 대표적인 지표는 GDP라고 할 수 있겠죠. 그러니까 everybody talks about GDP. And it's a common tool to compare a worldwide economy and also all different countries, okay? Whether they are in growth mode or they are in declining mode. 그 데피니션은 모든 그 물건들과 서비스, 우리가 물건을 만들거나 또는 서비스하는 게 우리 주요된 경제 활동이죠. 그래서 한 나라의 그 생산된 것 그리고 서비스가 프로바이드된 것에 모든 마켓 밸류를 더한 것이 결국은 GDP다. 포뮬러는 어떻게 계산을 하느냐 하면 consumption, 모든 그 spend 한 거 있죠. 쓴 돈, 그 다음에 investment 한 거, 부동산도 여기 들어갑니다. 부동산 집 사고, 부동산 인베스트먼트를 사고 이런 거 전부 다 일로 들어가고요. 그 다음에 government spending. 아시죠? 미국의 government, 미국의 정부는 어마어마한 회사죠. 회사로 따지자면. 국방비도 여기 들어갈 거고요. 국방비 예산이, 미국 국방부 예산이 일반적으로 전 세계의 국방부 예산의 50%가량 된다고 하니까 어마어마한 스펜딩이죠. 그거 다 더하고, net export는 뭐냐 하면, 그 export minus import. 그래서 export가 많으면, 그렇죠? export, 수출이 많으면 GDP는 증가하겠죠. 자, 그래서 조금 좀 디테일한 설명은 컨섬션은 우리가 다 알겠고요. 소비하는 거, household나 또 non-profit organization 이런 데서 모든 소비 C로 표시되고요. 그다음에 investment은 I로 표시되고, 그래서 business expenditure는 비즈니스 할 때 모든 스펜딩을 하겠죠. 그다음에 집 사는 거 이것도 마찬가지로 I로 들어가고, 그다음에 government spending G로 들어가서 government에 의해서 procure되는 모든 물건이나 서비스 이런 것이 G에 해당되고, net export는 말씀드린 대로 NX, 그래서 nations export minus import로 계산을 하면 GDP가 나온다. 참 이 계산을 어떻게 하는지 어메이징하죠. 이런 거를 계산을 한다는 것이 미국 정부의 그 Bureau of 뭐가 있죠? Bureau of Economic Agency인가요? 그래서 BEA 그 기관에서 이 모든 통계를 잡고 있는데 상상이 잘 안 가요. 어떻게 그걸 다 더할 수 있는 건지. 아무튼 GDP는 전체적으로 expenditure approach다. 그러니까 쓰는 거를 다 모은 거라 이런 얘기죠. 주로 three different 그룹을 얘기하는데 household, 모든 가정, 그 다음에 business entity, 그 다음에 government 이렇게 쓰는 거를 다 모은 거다. 그래서 GDP는 이제 각 나라마다 꼭 계산해서 킵을 하죠. 그리고 특히 월드뱅크나 IMF는 모든 나라의 걸 다 이제 모아서 그 킵을 하죠. historical GDP 데이터로 어떻게 성장했는지, 어떻게 이 나라가 망했는지 이런 걸 조사할 수 있다. 그리고 중요한 거 한 가지는 이 GDP 그로스를 계속 보면서 포지티브하게 GDP가 나가면 한 7쿼터 정도가 계속 포지티브다 그러면 우리가 이제 호황기로 본다. 익스펜션으로 경제가 익스펜션하는 걸로 보고, 그 다음에 한 2쿼터나 3쿼터가 계속적으로 마이너스가 나온다. GDP가 그러면 리세션으로 정의한다. 그거는 우리가 좀 상식적으로 알아두시면 좋을 것 같고요. 그 다음에 GDI는 GDP가 국민 총 생산이라고 그런다면 GDI는 국민 총 수입이 되겠죠. 그래서 domestic, gross domestic income이 되는데, definition은 지금 이 말에 있는 것처럼 모든 income을 더한 거예요. 공식은 어떻게 되냐면 wage라든지 profit이라든지, 그다음에 interest로 번 돈이라든지, 렌탈로 번 돈이라든지, tax, 그다음에 sum adjustment 이런 걸 다 더하면 결국은 GDI가 된다. 그래서 이론적으로는 GDI가 GDP하고 같아야 된대요. 네. 이론적으로는. 왜냐하면 GDI는 take in이고 내가 생산을 해내기 위해서 서비스를 제공하기 위해서 이제 돈이 들어가는 거죠. 그죠? 그러면 내가 일을 해서 뭔가 생산해내는 아웃풋이 나오죠. 그 아웃풋은 스펜딩 한 거로 다 더해지는 거예요. 그러니까 결국은 이게 in and out이 같아야 된다라고 하는 경제 이론이 있고요. 그다음에 이제 어떤 경제 평형을 이루었을 때는 이것이 같아져야 된다. GDI하고 GDP. 이제 재밌는 이 경제학자들끼리 얘기인데 GDI를 더 마니터링 했으면 리세션을 예상을 더 정확하게 할 수 있다. 뭐 이런 그 연구가 있었다고 해요. 보통은 GDP를 많이 보지만 그리고 GDI를 잘 워치아웃해서 그 중에서 employment compensation, 그러니까 봉급으로 가져가는 거, 커미션으로 가져가는 거, 이런 것들의 포션이 있을 거 아니겠어요? 그거를 보면 인플레이션인지 아닌지를 가름할 수가 있다. 그런 이제 이론적인 백그라운드가 있다. 그런 거고요. 지금 현재 그러면 어떻게 돌아가고 있느냐? 미국이 잠깐 좀 데이터를 좀 보면은 좀 클리어질 것 같아요. 우선 GDP를 보면 2021년도 4th 쿼터에는 플러스 1.7%였어요. 팬데믹 끝으로 가면서 그리고 이제 올해 들어와서 first 쿼터에는 마이너스로 갔어요. 마이너스 1.6%. 그리고 올해 그 다음에 second 쿼터에는 마이너스 0.6%로 갔어요. 그래서 데피니션에 의하면 사실은 두 쿼터가 마이너스잖아요, 그죠? 그러면 리세션으로 정의를 하는데 불황으로. 그러나 이제 뉴스에 또 이제 리캡이 나올 거예요. 조금 다른 의견들이 있고. 그래서 아무튼 그러니까 상식적으로 1년 전체에 2021년은 어떻게 됐느냐? 포지티브였어요. 10.1%. 그러니까 year over year겠죠, 그죠? 10% 증가가 그로스가 그래서 토탈 어마운트는 23 트릴리언 달러가 됐다. 근데 GDI는 사실은 포지티브 그로스였어요. 그래서 first quarter this year에 1.8%, 그 다음에 second quarter에는 1.4% 조금 줄어들긴 했지만, 그리고 2021년 annual GDI growth는 7.3%였다. 그러니까 지금 GDP하고 GDI하고 조금 다른데 GDI가 이 포지티브로 나오기 때문에 지금 어떤 경제학자들은 리세션이라고 할 수가 없다. 이렇게 지금 얘기를 하고 있는 거죠. 자, 그래서 GDI, GDP를 조금 들여다보면서 이게 우리가 뭐 리세션인지 아닌지 그냥 기분으로 얘기하는 게 아니라 이런 숫자적인 걸 가지고 조금 좀 살펴봤습니다. Okay, so today we covered definition and some differences between GDP and GDI. I hope this helped you to understand the economy in general and to understand whether we are in recession or not, and therefore what kind of mental preparation we should have. Okay, thank you for joining, and see you all next week.